Krista, do you have any public comments?
No, I didn't receive any.
Thank you. All right, well, it's 3:30. I'll call the March 9th, 2022 Executive Committee of the Dunn County Board of Supervisors to order. Let the roll show all the members are here except for Supervisor Steen, which is excused. Approval of the minutes.
Move we approve.
Supervisor Johnson moves, Supervisor Headland seconds. Any discussion? If not, all in favor of approving the minutes as printed, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. Public comments, we have none. We'll go right into the county manager's report. Review of the draft March 16th, 2022 county board agenda.
And the highlights include the recognizing the retired employees. Again, a lot of years walking out the door. Annual reports are due from Circuit Court, CJCC, and the district attorney. The question mark on reports of committees was answered before the meeting. Supervisor Anderson would like Supervisor Zons to be able to make a report on behalf of the CR&T committee. So we can have that one. Are there any other standing committees that would want to make reports at the meeting? Okay. And the rest of the items will be discussed subsequent in this meeting, unless there's anything else anyone wants to see on the agenda. That's it.
Thank you. I'll note this is the second month in a row that we have over 100 years of experience walking out our door. So quite a thing. Okay, moving on to 6 items placed at the request of the chair. First one is in-person meetings. I've been thinking about this. I've been watching the numbers. I've looked up KT's website or whatever. We're in the green the last I looked. And I've talked to other counties and what they're doing, and most of them have gone back to in-person meetings, the ones I've talked to. So KT, maybe we should hear your feelings on this, what you think. What do you think?
I love that the CDC's website is now mine. I'll totally take that. I did want to share that we are seeing a reduction in cases over time. So we're down to about 4.5 cases in our last 7 days per day, down from a peak just a couple short weeks ago of over 130 cases a day. So definitely seeing a reduction in cases that we're really excited to hope that it will hold. We do meet the criteria of low community level by the CDC. With that, they're taking into consideration flexibility in our hospital systems. So we are seeing flexibility in our hospital systems right now. There were many, many months where we had 0 to 1 ICU bed immediately available. And we had the majority of our health systems on peak census and or divert. And now we have, as of today, 10 ICU beds immediately available, and 6 of our 26 healthcare systems in the region are at peak census. Most of that related to staffing issues, which continues to be a concern, and the ability to find release folks that no longer need emergent care, but don't necessarily have a long-term care facility or rehab facility to be discharged to. So with that being said, I think with the CDC's designation as low, return to in-person meetings is an important way to get back into doing business. I think it's important that folks are allowed the ability to join remotely if they or their personal care provider believe that they are at high risk. I think that that's important. And I also think that it's important that folks wear a mask if they feel that that is within their own personal risk tolerance. So that would be my recommendations.
Okay, thank you. And that's right in line what I was going to suggest. So starting this month, our county board meetings will be in person. It'll be up to you as chairs of what you want to do with your own committee meetings. I think the option should be there that it would be a hybrid with Zoom capabilities. To do a Zoom meeting, the person doing it needs to have a license or something from them. And most of our department heads, if not all, have that already. It's about $20 a month for them, but we've been paying it, and I think the savings would be there if you think about PR&D, for instance, of all the department heads that sometimes come to the meeting and only participate in just a few minutes of the meeting. So I think that would be a good thing that we keep the Zoom portion going. Also for the county board, I would like to keep that going in case a county board member is out of town or whatever, not feeling well, and they could participate via Zoom. The big question I have is whether we should keep recording. The recording part and the live stream part are separate. We don't have to live stream, but we could record, and the recording would come up 3 hours or whatever after the meeting is done. And I've heard many different opinions on that. Supervisor Steen told me yesterday that his opinion was if somebody wanted to listen to the meeting, it should be important enough for them that they could come to the meeting. I talked to Dan Dunbar today and about some of these questions, and he said he likes the recording. He frequently watches the meeting a day or so later. So that's just two opinions that I've heard within the last 24 hours. The big question on the recording, I think, is how long we have to keep those recordings, store them, because Dan didn't feel there would be an expense unless we have to keep them for a certain amount of time. So Nick, Dan said you've kind of looked into this a little bit. Have you come up with an answer?
I haven't. I do think that we keep the recordings longer than is legally necessary. And so where the problem with it comes in is that it costs money to store and back up computer data. And Dan was explaining to me that, is Dan on the line? I hope I get this right. For every gigabyte of original data that we have, whether it's a letter or a resolution or a PowerPoint presentation or a video, the way the backups work, it ends up creating, I think he said 16 gigabytes of data usage for storage. And so when you think of, and a gigabyte isn't very much anymore, but when you think about all of the stuff that we have, it really begins to blossom into a very large data storage requirement. And that costs money. And that's an issue that Dan and I are going to be working on here in the next few months to try to determine how long we'll keep certain types of records, including the backups. The backups themselves take up space. And the more copies that we keep of them, the more space we need to store them. So I haven't reached a final conclusion on it right now, but I do think that if you decide to continue with it, we're going to be okay. And at some point in the next couple of months, I think we'll have a better idea of what we want to recommend for retention of all kinds of online storage or data that's stored, but in particular the video recordings. Now, they're not legally required, and their utility is only, it's a generous gesture, I'd say, for lack of better words. It's not required, and so a decision to continue with it is consistent with the law, and a decision to stop doing it is consistent with the law also. And I don't think we're at a point of running out of space right now for storage, but I do think we keep them longer than we are legally required to. And so then it becomes kind of a decision about, is the value in having them archived greater, or the need for storage space, or perhaps the value of having them archived not as great after a certain point of time. But we'll be able to make that decision. I think today what I would suggest is you make a decision as to whether you wish the recordings to continue. And if you do, we'll fix the rest of it in fairly short order.
Well, I guess talking with Dan and what you've said, I would suggest that we continue with the Zoom part. So if somebody would rather not be in person, they can attend the meeting, not to live stream, but to record, so that somebody could watch our meeting the next day or a few hours after it's over.
Well,
that would be my suggestion. It's not an action item. So I don't know, I would guess we'll have to put it as an action item for our next executive meeting, but that would be my suggestion. Or maybe we didn't need to take an action item to start Zoom, so maybe we don't need an action item to stop it either. I don't know.
My only comment is that we have to be able to offer members of the public access to it, and it might be valuable, at least for transitional purposes, to have the live streaming there, just as people get used to. It's been 2 years and it seems kind of strange for everyone to meet in a room now, to be honest with you. It takes a little bit of getting used to, and maybe a couple of months of that as a transitional approach to turning it off would be good.
If we do that, then we may have to continue having personnel at the meetings, and that's what I was trying to stay away from. Both Krista and Dan, I talked with both of them today, and they felt that the department heads could run a Zoom meeting, so we wouldn't need to have added personnel at the meetings.
It's a good.
And so
Thank you.
unless I misunderstood, Dan, we could probably record without having personnel there, but if we were to live stream, we may need. And that's, I guess that's where the idea I'm coming from, or my thoughts.
There's nothing inappropriate about that. It was just a suggestion for transitional purposes, but as long as the room's available, as long as the room is announced in the meeting notice and there's space available for people to participate, the requirements of the meeting law will be met.
Well,
Or observe, I should say.
I definitely mean to keep public comments on the meetings for in-person public comments. So I don't know, that's my feeling. What do you, thumbs up, thumbs down? What do you think? Discussion?
Mr. Chair,
Supervisor Tripp.
a couple of things. Number one, there's an obvious cost and some logistical things to consider, but if possible, and if it's reasonable, I really like the idea of being able to zoom into a meeting when it's necessary. That has allowed me to attend any number of meetings. I've been out of town significantly lately. So if we can maintain that availability, that'd be super. And I know there are costs and it's a trade-off, so I understand that. The second thing is I find the recordings of the meetings really useful. I have watched any number of committee meetings now that have been recorded that I would not have been able to participate in, wouldn't have been able to get to, or that I can look at now in a half an hour rather than taking an hour and a half or 2 hours to actually go to the meeting. So again, if it's reasonable, if it's possible, if it's doable, if it's feasible, having those recordings available is really helpful. And I think the public finds that as well. So, again, if the cost isn't prohibitive, if the legal requirements are being met, I'd really like to be able to maintain both those options.
And that's exactly what I'm proposing, Supervisor Tripp. Go ahead, Supervisor Morehouse.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have absolutely no idea how much the general public views the recordings, but I really like the idea of having our proceedings easily publicly available. So that's number one. And number two, I just will pile on Supervisor Tripp. I find it extremely helpful to check into other standing committees that I wouldn't otherwise have the time or the ability to attend. It's been helpful. I feel like I have much more information as a result. Again, I don't know how much it costs. I don't know how much public utilization there really is, but it seems like a really good way to continue to interact as directly as we can with the public.
I don't think the cost is going to be prohibited unless we find out that we have to keep those recordings for a substantially long time. Supervisor McCullough.
I'm thinking that there are a few, particularly of the subcommittees rather than the standing committees, where it might be advantageous to be able to hold those virtually. I'm thinking specifically of traffic safety and EMS, where we have participants from all over the county and a couple of people at the state level. And I know it's been very helpful for them to be able to tune into those meetings remotely. I'm sure we could do it as a hybrid, but that's one case where I think keeping those virtual might be to our advantage. It would be nice to at least have that option for a few things.
And I was thinking of those when I said that it would be up to the chair of that committee on how they would want that committee meeting to be held. So like traffic safety, emergency management, I could see that those two, for sure, people come from all over, from different businesses, that those would would work very well continuing to be virtual. That would be up to that chair as far as I'm concerned, but maybe some other ones that I'm not thinking of that also would be that way.
If I might, yeah, the main reason I wanted to point at that one specifically is if it's completely virtual as opposed to hybrid, then we might need to live stream it to meet the open meetings rules.
So. All right, that'll be something to take into consideration. But the chair would have to take that into consideration when how they set the meeting up. So should we try that? Thumbs up? All right, thank you. Okay, we'll move on to legislative policy initiative. Supervisor Tripp sent us a proposal. I totally agree with the proposal. I've talked with Gary, and if your chair and vice chair are the same, I would definitely move towards something like this. I've also talked to Gary being the vice chair of taking over some other things, some other duties, because Supervisor Tripp, that has been very involved in the WCA is leaving us, sorry to say. So I suggested that maybe the vice chair get involved in WCA. And I also talked to the vice chair about going to the Greater Menominee Economic Development meetings as the Dunn County point person. Mr. Miller has been attending those, and with Mr. Lang being interim and still being corporation counsel, I felt that maybe that would be one less meeting he'd have to attend. So either Supervisor Steen or myself will try to take on some of that other stuff, but if Supervisor Steen can do it as vice chair, I would be more than happy with it. Speaking to this, I think it's great, but I don't think we should make a decision or anything until we have the new board, because I think it should be up to, I think the new chair, whoever the chair is, if it's me, that's great. I would endorse this, but if it's somebody else, maybe they won't. That's my thoughts. So any other thinking? Supervisor Tripp.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate your support for this idea. One of the things that I've thought about over the last couple of years is institutionalizing the role of the legislative program in the county. And one way to do that, and I'm not saying this is the only one, but one way that I felt might be effective is to designate the vice chair as the chair of the legislative committee. It would require, and you see in the proposal, a fairly minor change to the ordinances. And as I've thought about this since I sent this proposal out, there might be some other small wording changes that might be required, and I'd leave that up to Nick. For example, in the first paragraph of Chapter 2, Section 5, it says that the chair and the vice chair of all standing committees will be appointed by the county board chair. That language might need to be adjusted a little bit. I'm not quite sure. It's not a major change, but it would it might need to be something like that. Also, the legislative chair would not, there's nothing in the proposal that I've shared with you at least to account for a vice chair of that committee. So that there might be some small issues there that would have to be dealt with. That's not my point though. My point really is, over the last couple of years, I think our legislative program has gone from kind of zero. Well, I shouldn't say that, because when Steve Rasmussen was the chair of the board, he was also on WCA, and he was very active in politics. And we did quite a lot of activity with the county ambassadors program. But since Steve left, that's not been quite true. And then the pandemic rolled around, and that threw a monkey wrench into everything. But I think by making a change such as the one I've suggested, we would institutionalize the idea that the legislative chair has a life, the legislative committee has a life of its own, sort of outside the executive committee or beside the executive committee. And I can't help but think that a more active program would yield results. You can argue with the methodology, you can suggest other means of accomplishing this. This is just a suggestion, and I think the goal is valid, and I think the procedure is doable. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, one more thing. This is not an action item, so it was intended only for discussion today. But in terms of timing, I think that if the executive committee first, and then if the board of supervisors were to accept basically this idea, it would be helpful for any potential vice chair candidates to know this ahead of time. We don't necessarily have to, I say we, but you don't necessarily have to take any action on this. But I think knowing about it ahead of time will be useful to potential vice chair candidates.
Any other discussion, thoughts? Supervisor Hedlund.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the good idea, Jim. I reading through it was impressed with the idea that I think that it is important. We've got good leadership from Mr. Miller and in getting an active legislative program going. And I think that, I don't know, I think if you want to be heard, you got to be out there participating and being seen at some of these meetings, so that if nothing else, our legislators know we're keeping an eye on them. So I would like to see us go forward with this in whatever way everybody sees to think is right. But I like the idea. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we'll bring it back at a future meeting as an action item.
Mr. Chair.
Supervisor Tripp.
Can I ask if the committee would think it was prudent to add this item as a discussion item at the March board meeting? Wouldn't have to be an action item, but we could do the same thing at the March board meeting that we've done here today. Simply introduce the idea so that people have some concept of what we're thinking of prior to the election and prior to the election of the new chair and vice chair.
That is fine with me.
Do we need a motion to do that or anything?
We can't make a motion for that because it's not an action item, but we can put something on the agenda without a motion.
And that's all. I think a little discussion on the full board level might be helpful.
Supervisor Baines, you're going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to support what Jim just said. I think it would be good to get it out there. I think it's a great idea, and it was well thought out, and I thank you, Jim, for it. But I would be in favor of at least getting it presented before the whole board.
Mr. Miller.
It can be added under reports of committees under executive. That'll allow it to be discussed.
Okay. Thank you. Anything else? If not, we'll move on for consideration of actions to be taken by the Executive Committee FY 2023 capital improvement goals for debt and levy. All right. Who wants to start with this? Mr. Miller.
I'd like to give you, introduce the background on this, what we're doing here, and then give our CFO, Beata, an opportunity to tell you what we've pulled together for capital improvement projects, and then come back to me with, try to frame the action item considerations for executive. So with that brief outline in mind, last year, you'll recall, we adopted a capital improvement program, which is a 5-year rolling program, in an effort to avoid the peaks and valleys that we had traditionally encountered, where we only looked ahead 1 year at what capital projects might be necessary and adjusted as these things came along. The idea on a 5-year rolling capital improvement program is to take a further look out and try to be strategic about how we are going to finance these programs, to be strategic about which improvements are done when, how to prioritize them, and at least give us a sense of the landscape in front of us so that we can smooth out those peaks and valleys of financing and try to take a more measured and thoughtful approach towards necessary capital improvements. So the board adopted in March of last year, or in April rather of last year, a capital improvement plan for the years 22 through 26. The idea each year being that we would move 1 year forward and each year have the opportunity to review and endorse or change the goals that are adopted. So that's what's in front of you today, is the goals that we're going to have with respect to capital improvements for the years 23 through 27. And those goals are related to use of levy, use of debt, and use of any other funds that we may have available in terms of the capital improvement program, which is one part of the overall county board budget. We're doing it early in the year so that we can factor in the decisions of the county board into the broader budget discussion that takes place later in the year. So with that introduction, I'll ask Beata to review for you what we got from the managers in terms of capital projects going forward for the next 5 years.
Hello, everyone. I want to start by kind of reiterating what had taken place in 22 and 2026 and our budget money-wise. So I wanted to kind of also compare that to where are we at, where did we arrive at for requests in 2023 to 2027. So last time we sat and did this process, the board has adopted a CIP recommend for 42.6 million. So I also looked to see out of that, how was that funded? As you see, 35% at that time was funded by debt. 37% of that was levy. And then the remainder of that 27% was funded by the general transportation aid. It was some fees we had, vehicle registration. And of course, there was the American Rescue Plan Act funds, which we know as ARPA. So specific for 2022, our KIP that was adapted was at 8.57 million. And again, I also looked at and broke it down to how was that funded just for that 1 year. Then I went through each managed department and their KIP requests for 23 to 27. I compiled all their requests and they're all total to be an estimated 48 million. And again, looking at the historical way of how we were funding it, making the assumption that we would carry, adapt using levy and borrowing. So again, here that meaning that there will be no change in the increase in dollars in levy, or we will still maintain that $3 million borrowing. So as you see, is consistent percentages we arrive at. But in addition to that, given the higher request for 23 to 27 at 48 million, we have a gap. So I've also accounted for some of the ARPA money, and also we have about 6% are requested without funding source. And I've attached you a more detailed document that goes by each department and what is it that they requested. So that is in the for those 23 to 27 at that 48 million. Now looking specifically at just 23. So we have approximately of a $10 million of requested capital improvement projects. And I also here made the same assumption that we would have no levy increase and no increase in debt beyond that 3 million. So we here have presented here to you, again, that 30% of that what we need would be funded, assuming would be the debt 3 million. And again, we are at that 31% being levy. And then 25% of that, it's expected to be funded again by grant fees and the vehicle registration fees. And then we have a remaining gap of 14%, or an estimated 1.4 million. Okay, and that could be closed using ARPA money. So any questions on that detail?
If I may, Mr. Chair, I'd like to share my screen. I've got a spreadsheet that may help focus the committee's deliberations on the CIP in general and 2023 in particular, since it's the imminent coming year. With your approval?
Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. Hopefully you can all see. Is it large enough to read? Make it bigger. So what we've got here in this simple spreadsheet, we've got our requests for 2023 capital improvements of $10 million. Consideration number one that the committee wants to look at is, do we want to do all of those projects? Again, the projects came from the departments. It's your professional staff's assessment on necessary improvements to continue to deliver services efficiently to county residents. But there's no obligation to the county board to endorse those. So part of what you want to do in your deliberations now and ultimately at the workshop on March 26th, county board workshop on the capital improvement program, is do you want to approve all or just some of those requested projects? Understanding that not approving some of them doesn't necessarily mean the need goes away, and it may come up as a greater need, which compounds the costs in subsequent years if it's deferred. The second issue is, how much do we expect of levy? The FB refers to the fund balance to be applied to capital projects. Last year, we did $3.1 million of levy applied to capital projects. So what we've built in here is the assumption that you guys might want to do the same, but there are considerations there as well. the total fund balance, we won't have a good handle on until we get the audit for last year. So we don't know how much in the fund balance we have to play with to apply to capital improvement projects. We don't know what, for instance, salary and benefits, which we know are going up, will do to the overall general fund. And we have a goal of retaining at least 30% of our total operating costs in our fund balance. That's important for our credit rating when we do go out for debt, for borrowing. So there's a lot of unknowns associated with this figure. It may be a reasonable assumption that we will be able to devote that much, but it is unknown. The debt here of $3 million reflects the decision of the county board last year. You'll recall that the capital improvement program that was adopted included a program of borrowing $3 million a year to help afford the projects. There were 42 million then, there's now 48 million. It's not something that works its way down and disappears. There's always need for capital improvements. But plugging in that number simply because that is what the county board decided last year. Consideration that the committee wants to take up, and the board ultimately, is what's going to happen with interest rates. Right now, interest rates are still attractive. Beata told me that it's about 1.7%. But we also know the Fed has been talking about rising interest rates. We know inflation is something that we're dealing with. It may last, it may not. The Fed has signaled a willingness to raise interest rates maybe more than once. So a real question is whether or not interest rates are likely to be lower in 23 than in 24. And that plays into the decision about borrowing or how much to borrow. This figure is the projected revenue available from the fees that Beata was referring to, including the vehicle registration fee, general transportation aids, excuse me, trade-in values on some of the vehicles that we would be replacing. And when we do this simple math, the total cost of the capital projects requested and those funding sources, we have a deficit of $1.3 million, which brings us to ARPA. We had an allocation of $8.8 million. We dedicated, as part of the capital improvement program last year, $3.2 million. We allocated another $100,000 just recently to support rural broadband projects. That leaves us with $5.5 million in ARPA, which needs to be spent, or at least earmarked for spending by the end of 24. I believe they've extended the actual period of time to spend it. $5.5 million. If we only made up the deficit, 1.3, that would leave $4.2 million of ARPA. And a consideration on that is the next year's capital improvement, 2024 capital projects, which at this point is $11 million. So one of the values of doing a 5-year program that's rolling is we don't make the decision about any one year in isolation. You make it with consideration to the subsequent years. And this is a case in point. We could spend more of the ARPA money, but we've got this $11 million in capital improvement requests that we know is pending for the subsequent year. So I'm happy to answer any questions on this, but I do want to conclude, I think, with, I asked the county board chair if he wanted a recommendation from staff, from your county manager and your CFO. Chairman Bartlett indicated he did. And so we have prepared a recommendation. I wanted to preface by observing that this is a recommendation. It is not an attempt, as has been characterized in the past by some members, it's not an attempt to control the board, tell the board what to do, or take the authority of the board. Like any other professional staff you have, this is professional advice, no different than when you receive legal advice from your corporation counsel or advice on veterans programs from your veterans Affairs Officer. So with that preface in mind, in looking it over, Beata and I put our heads together. Our recommendation is that we borrow $3 million for the following reasons. We expect that interest rates for borrowing will be lower in 23 than in 24. So if you're going to borrow one year and maybe not the other, it may make sense to borrow next year as opposed to the following year. If we did, that 4.2 of ARPA remaining is a cushion that potentially could be used to make up a gap should the levies, should the fund balance not be sufficient to provide the $3.1 million for dedicating to a capital improvement project. So it becomes a cushion that if we don't have enough, if we're in danger of falling below that 30%, we could potentially make it up. If we don't need to, if the fund balance is healthy enough that we can allocate $3.1 million to levy from the fund balance, that 4.2 then becomes a possibility for deferring or skipping borrowing in 24, again, when interest rates might be higher. And then the final consideration on this recommendation is the 24 projects, the $11 million. If you add them up, if we did the same thing again, 3.2 million in the levy, and borrowed 3 million in debt, and we had 2.6 million in fees, we still need 2.2 million. That's where ARPA, again, as we see in this first page here, ARPA is available to make up the gap. The gap in 11, if all of those things remain the same, would be $2.2 million. Now, that's not the full 4.2. It's possible. Another approach would be, instead of 3 million in debt, use the final remaining amount of ARPA if it's not already been allocated, and only borrow 1 million instead of 3. Be that as it may, given the uncertainties, interest rates, how much we're going to have in our fund balance that's available to be applied to capital improvement programs, and the coming years needs for capital improvements in light of our funding sources, the recommendation from staff is as it's laid out here, including for 23 issuing debt in the amount of $3 million. Sorry for the long-winded nature of the presentation, but what we're looking for finally, or in conclusion, is this committee wants to make a recommendation, just as Highway Committee made a recommendation on use of ARPA for its capital needs, and just as PR&D made a recommendation on the use of ARPA at its recent meeting. This committee wants to make a recommendation to the full county board for the county board workshop scheduled for March 26th on the levy, which would be, if this recommendation were followed, at least equaling what was done in 22, 3.1 million, on debt and on ARPA. So those are the issues I think that are in front of the committee for discussion and ultimately a recommendation.
All right, thank you for the presentation. I will start with my comments because I don't agree with the recommendation. Looking at the sheet, attachment 3, if you looked at the 21 principal payments, if we borrow the $3 million, keep borrowing it every year like we suggested last year, that in 21 our principal payment was $3,563,000. It steadily goes up about $500,000 a year up to the year 2025. And that year it'll be $5,311,000. And then in 26, the principal payment would drop about $700,000. And the next year in 27, it drops another close to $500,000. I guess what I'm getting at is that the money we borrowed last year, we haven't paid, the residents haven't paid taxes on that yet. That $3 million will be on their payment on their taxes next year. And and if we keep borrowing, we're going to end up with a great big expensive high levy limit paying the 2025 and 2026. The residents will pay in 2026. I would like us to use $3 million of our ARPA funds and not borrow this year to try to lower that balloon and level it off as much as possible. I realize that we have to try to struggle. We're going to struggle with being able to borrow new debt and put it on the levy until we get the neighbors paid off. That's where our expense is. One way or the other, if we didn't have that, right now, $13 million in debt to the neighbors, we wouldn't, this one looks so bleak as far as I'm concerned with that, putting the money on the levy. But we do. That's all on the levy. And we're adding $3 million a year to it. So I guess that's my feeling. I really feel we should consider using that $3 million and not borrow this year from ARPA funds. I realize interest rates could go up in 24, but we wouldn't be borrowing that money until 23. We don't know what those interest rates are going to be either. So I don't know, that's my feeling. I guess the other thing, I think Mr. Miller talked about a decision of leaving all the capital asks in. I think at this time, we should leave them all in until the committees have had more time to look at them and further down in the budget process. I think at this point, we should leave that $10 million or whatever the ask is this year. So I'll open it up to any other discussion. You've heard my view, my point.
Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Supervisor Tripp.
If we borrow any amount of money during the year 2022 or 2023, at what point would that borrowing actually take place? And what I'm getting at is, I think everybody expects, although nobody can tell the future, we all expect that interest rates are going to continue to increase, probably gradually. But what I'm trying to get a handle on is if we were to borrow this year as opposed to next year, what would the likely difference in interest rates be? And I apologize for asking a question nobody can answer, but at some point we need to project what our best guess is. Because
I don't think anybody can answer what the interest rates are going to be, but if we were to borrow $3 million for next year, in the past, it seems we've gone out to bond in about the first quarter of the year.
So we're talking that would be fairly soon then.
Well, that would be the first quarter of 2023.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry, 2022.
And the first quarter of, if we borrowed for the 23 budget, we would go out for the first quarter of 2024.
Generally speaking, if we're going to use, let's just use the figure $3 million. If we're going to use $3 million of ARPA money or borrowing, and we can borrow at a cheaper rate this year than we can next year, it seems to me that we borrow it this year at the lower rate, use the ARPA money next year. That it seems to me that that would provide us at least some marginal savings if the interest rates were to go up 0.5% or 1%.
And that, I totally agree with that if I didn't worry about what the payment was going to be to pay that off for our homeowners and our residents.
But
That's what I'm thinking of.
Right, and I don't disagree with you a bit. I mean, that's what we ought to be thinking of. And once again, I could talk about the state legislature, but I won't. But if we're going to borrow 1 year, and again, let's just use the figure $3 million. If 1 year we're going to borrow and 1 year we're going to use ARPA money, it seems like we would do the borrowing at the time when the interest rate was lower, because whether we borrow for 2022 or 2023, or in 2022 or 23, the taxpayers are going to pay it one way or the other, and the earlier we borrow, the less they will pay in interest.
Right. Any other discussion? Supervisor Maves.
Yeah, I agree with what Mr. Tripp has just said, but the one thing in the back of my mind is then if we go down that thought process, then we're going to have to be earmarking $3 million of ARPA for potential use next year. If I understand things correctly. I mean, I'm not so sure that the ARPA money will be there unless we set it aside, you know, put it in a glass jar and bury it in the backyard someplace. That's the only thing that's running through my mind now, is whether we'll have actually that ARPA money there.
I wouldn't be. Supervisor Morehouse, you had something?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I seem to be piling on people today, but I absolutely agree with Jim. We know what the current interest rate climate is. It is extremely likely that it will go up. I think the Fed is talking about raising interest rates 4 or 5 times possibly. So capital needs don't go away. I know that there is reluctance to borrow, but it really does make sense to me to borrow now and allocate ARPA funds for potential use in 2024.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Miller.
just a clarification. We issued the bond, we issued the debt for 22 in November of 21. So we would
Okay.
anticipate issuing the debt for 23 in November of this year.
All right. So I stand corrected. Supervisor Quinn.
Yes, I'm inclined to agree with the 3 million borrowing next year and the general proposal laid out by staff. I think it's prudent. I can understand the concern about abusing the ARPA funds, but I just don't see that happening. I think we're a responsible enough body that we as long as we're going to retain those funds to cover this period, and I don't know what we need to do to officially sanction that, but some kind of resolution could be passed that while it wouldn't be binding, I understand it would clearly state the goal of the board. So I tend to move in that direction.
And I'm sorry for interrupting again, but I do want to offer for the committee's consideration. One of the things that can be achieved by the county board at the workshop on March 26th is precisely the future of remaining ARPA funds. So if, as Supervisor Maves said, it was ultimately the consensus to preserve that money against the capital improvement needs in 24, that could be an outcome of your budget, of your CIP workshop on the 26th.
And looking at this budget for this year, that your proposal, we would have to save all the rest of it for that, because we're using 1.4, and we're borrowing 3 million. So if we were going to, we would need to set aside all that's left.
Yeah, again, in the presentation that staff put together for you, we would, if everything else were equal, the same amount of levy, 3 million in borrowing for 24, 2.6 million in fees for 24. There would be a need for 2.2 million of ARPA to cover the $11 million of projected capital improvements in 24. If we didn't allocate the remainder, we're talking about 4.2. If we only need 2.2 for capital improvements, it's potential there'd be $2 million there that instead of borrowing 3 in 24, maybe the county only borrows 1 million. But it all depends on how the county board, that's the whole point of this, is to have this committee make a recommendation to inform the discussion by the full county board with respect to levy, debt, and ARPA.
Any other discussion?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Supervisor Anderson, then Supervisor Headland.
thank you. Yes, we're talking about the big items, and I totally agree. And we need to do that first. But I want to also not forget, one of these was fees that we get. And I think our county board needs to be reminded that, if I'm correct, 2 years ago, we approved the resolution for a vehicle registration fee, and that has brought in a lot of money. We ought to remind everybody what that does. Am I wrong when I thought there had a sunshine clause on that? And if that's the case, we need to renew that again, or it's going to drop and we won't get it. Am I correct on that?
Yes,
If I might.
Paul's nodding his head.
Supervisor
So-
McCullough will answer that.
Yeah, if I might, we had that discussion at the Highway Committee today, and we are putting together a resolution that will go forward to the county board for the April meeting, because to renew the vehicle registration fee at the current rate. It will need to go through the typical 2 readings process, so it would be April and May. The statute required us to review by July, so that's where it stands at the moment.
I appreciate that update, Kelly. Thank you.
Supervisor Headland, you had.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I certainly respect your sentiments towards the fact that no matter what we do, borrowing is borrowing and has to be paid back. But I also look back at the fact that if we borrow at a better rate, that is a savings also. And we're going to apply these funds, ARPA funds, to help balance this out over the next couple of years. I think again, I don't want to see us get into this peak and valley thing where all of a sudden we need to borrow $5 million and we only anticipated in our schedule year 3. So I guess if we're going to end up having to borrow in 23 and 24, I think we'd be better off in 23. Thank you.
Supervisor McCullough.
I would like to agree with Jim's original point about if we're going to borrow, we would be better off doing it at the lower interest rates. I will note that with the hard infrastructure bill that passed the Capitol, we may have a little bit more money available to us for certain kinds of projects next year that is currently not on the calendar, which might also allow us to leave the borrowing next year.
I would also like to add that there's also an opportunity to consider refinance existing debt that's at a higher rate to a lower rate that could have potential savings. And when we meet at the workshop, I'll be prepared with a simulator for you so that we can do all these scenarios. Also, when I send out the request for the capital improvement projects, I also asked the requesters to then identify priority, either is it immediate, high priority, moderate, or low. So then if it comes to the point where board wants to prioritize based on what other departments see as priority, then there's also that opportunity to look at those that are moderate or even very low priority to either forego to have some savings and decrease the debt that we would take on.
All right, thank you. Any other speaking? Not? Time for a vote. I'll call for a roll call
You
vote.
want a motion first?
What?
You want a motion first?
Oh, didn't I get a motion? I'm sorry. I need a motion. Supervisor Tripp moves.
And I'd like to add to the motion.
Seconds.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to add to the motion that the recommendation that Supervisor Maves made, that in the resolution where we recommend this plan, we also recommend specifically designated the appropriate amount of ARPA funds that will remain for capital projects. I don't know.
I may have missed a motion because I don't recall a motion being articulated. I apologize. Could that
recommend to the county board the capital borrowing plan.
As presented by staff?
Yes.
And with the caveat that the remaining ARPA funds be set aside for future capital improvement projects as well?
An appropriate amount of those ARPA
amount,
funds. Right. As I understand, we've got more than, yeah, because I think Supervisor Maves is right. We need to formalize the use of those funds so they don't get frittered away somewhere else. You know, we stop by and buy candy and beer or something like that with them, and then pretty soon they're gone.
You can't use those funds for candy and beer anyway, so.
What if we buy them in the Capitol? Never mind.
Still no.
All right. Any other discussion? If not, I'll have a roll call vote. Mr. Miller, could you please take the roll?
Yes. Supervisor Johnson.
Aye.
Supervisor Quinn. Supervisor Quinn.
Aye.
Thank you. Supervisor Maves.
Aye.
Supervisor Anderson.
Yes.
Supervisor Morehouse.
Yes.
Supervisor Headland.
Yes.
Supervisor McCullough.
Aye.
Supervisor Tripp.
Yes.
Chairman Bartlett.
No. All right. Motion passes. That'll be the recommendation going forward. Moving on to 8. Consideration of reports, resolutions, ordinances to the county board from the executive committee. Resolution approving the FY 2021 carry forwards and the FY 2022 budget adjustments. I need a motion for that.
Mr. Chair, I
Chairman.
support.
Handling moves, Supervisor Morehouse seconds. Okay, speaking to this, Deanna, did we lose you?
I'm here.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see you. All right, go ahead.
With the carry forward. So our request, I went and met with individual departments again. We verified in great detail what it is that was truly expense, what's the true number to carry forwards. So all figures are verified and reviewed by my peers. And you.
Are there any questions? It was quite detailed report. Anybody have any questions on this? If
I would
not,
just, could I just add,
yes,
all of the carry forwards and amendments being proposed were all incorporated into one resolution by our CFO in order to, I guess, make it a little more efficient to discuss it. That's
Right.
why it's so long.
Good.
and I appreciate that. I think that's very good.
Some of you have seen some of these sections in previous committees.
So if there's no other discussion, all in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed, motion carried. All right. 8B, a resolution proclaiming April as National County Government Month. I need a motion for that. Supervisor McCullough moves, Supervisor Tripp seconds. Something we've done numerous years. Any discussion? If not, all in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carried. Item 8C is an ordinance amending the county code of ordinances regarding board meetings. I need a motion for this.
I'll move approval, Mr.
Supervisor
Chairman.
Morehouse moves. Supervisor McCullough seconds. Now I got all sorts of hands up, like at an auction. All right, speaking to this, Mr. Lang, do you want to explain this or who's speaking to this?
No, I can, thank you. This is kind of on my initiative for the last 2 or 3 years for sure. We've been having more county board meetings that are in addition to what our regularly scheduled meetings are. And under the existing board rules, it's necessary to circulate a petition to have the meeting scheduled, to schedule a special meeting. And of course, back in the before COVID, it was pretty easy. People could just swing by and while they were here to pick up their mail in their mailbox or whatever, and they could sign the petition. You could bring it around to meetings and have them sign. And it's gotten more complicated. And so now we've been relying on email surveying really in order to get the required number of requests from supervisors in order to have the meetings. And since these meetings, the legislative meeting, where we invite legislative representatives to interact with the County Board of Supervisors, a budget workshop, this year will be coming up on March 26th. And then in October, it's been useful to have the ability to adjust the timeline. State statutes dictate fairly tight tolerances on the time periods for various activities relating to the county's budget. Publication of the notice of public hearing, exchanging data with the Department of Revenue and so forth. And for the past 2 years, we have actually had to adjust the date of the October county board meeting in order to accommodate that. And the November county board meeting there's some flexibility there, but it's a fairly rigidly determined meeting date that's set by statute rather than by county ordinance. Our ordinance sets it at a certain date, but it conforms with the directive of the statute. So what I did is I drafted this amendment for the rules of the board, which would sort of eliminate the extra petition activity that we've employed in order to get a county board meeting moved in October, for example, in order to meet budget and levy timelines, and to schedule special meetings in February and March, as we've been doing for the legislative interaction and the budget workshop. Instead, giving authority to just establish those meeting dates to the executive committee. So for example, at the executive committee's January meeting, they could determine the date of the legislative meeting. They could determine the date of the budget workshop or capital improvement meeting. And then later in the year, if it becomes clear, usually it's Keith or the CFO says, hey, we're not going to have enough time between the October county board meeting and the November county board meeting. We need to move it. If that becomes apparent at some point in time, the executive committee could just take an action to move the October county board date a week earlier, which is what we've done the past 2 years. And so that's really it in a nutshell. It just eliminates the extra work of petitioning. And I guess the balance is that there's great utility in all of these things and flexibility. And so I just propose this as something that you could consider in order to achieve those ends, and just eliminate the need for petitioning for these particular meetings. For all other meetings, it would stay the same.
Any questions? If not, all in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carried.
If I may, Mr. Chair, Nick, is that a first reading?
Yeah, it would come in as a first reading next week
Got it.
and a second reading in April, yes.
Thank you.
Moving on to 9A. This is review of reports, resolutions, and ordinances coming from the county to the county board from standing committees. From the Highway Committee, we have a resolution proclaiming Work Zone Awareness Week. A1. Any discussion on this? Any questions? This is something also that we've done other years. Moving on to A2 is a resolution appointing county highway commissioner. Any speaking to this?
We're very pleased to have Dustin accept our offer, and we're hoping the county board will go ahead and ratify our decision on Dustin. He's a great asset to the county, and I think he will be with us for many years.
Thank you. Any discussion, questions? Not? From the Committee on Administration, a resolution regarding elected officials' compensation. Supervisor Headland, you want to explain anything on this?
There we go. Certainly, Mr. Chair. Before election time comes up for obviously elected officials, by statute, we have to determine what the wages are going to be for those elected positions, so that anyone involved in consideration for seeking those positions know what their compensation level will be. If you looked at the resolution, hope you all did, you'll see it spells out two officials, the sheriff, number one, and below that, the clerk of courts. Both of these current officials had a good presentation to the Committee on Administration, where they had done a lot of homework of their current wage situation and compared to other wages being paid to similar positions in throughout this part of Wisconsin. And so the committee then basically went along and decided to follow what their recommendations were. You can see it's quite a jump, especially for the sheriff. However, because of the fact that we had only put in a 2% increase for the sheriff position per year, and we basically, for the most part, paid 4.75%, 2% cost of living and a 2.75% step. People underneath the sheriff were going to be bypassing that position and actually earning higher rates of compensation. And so we felt it was necessary, if you look at these steps for these two positions, that we went to a 4.75% increase per year to keep them at a pace above the people that work underneath them. So that's why we came up with the numbers we did there. Any questions? Thank you.
Any questions? Supervisor Morehouse?
I just have a question about the treasurer and the county clerk. Are those compensation packages established at a later date?
Yes.
Before the election?
Right.
There's an alternation. Dunn County has 5 elected constitutional officers. So the sheriff and the clerk of courts are elected in this year, and then for 4-year terms. And then in 2 years, we'll be setting the salaries for the Register of Deeds, the county clerk, and the county treasurer. So they do that so that not all of the offices expire at the same time. It's good for turnout at the polls, but they're all 4-year terms. They just alternate.
Right.
Any other questions? If not, thank you. Moving on to 9B, 2, resolution amending the employee handbook from the Committee on Administration.
Okay, again, Mr. Chair, this is Vaughn. If there's any questions, glad to try to answer them, or I'm sure Mr. Miller or someone else could. Basically, there's a couple important parts to this. One is that previously we had added another holiday. We had added Martin Luther King holiday as a paid holiday for staff. And so because we did not have a contract with the people who serve under our powers of arrest contract, we need to make an adjustment to those positions also. And so that was part of this, what's going on here. The other part is there's a request because of the continued struggle of HR and department managers and such to hire new staff, that oftentimes people come here as a candidate and they are offered vacation time right up front from other positions and other situations. And of course, we didn't have that available. And so that is something they're seeking to do, 40 hours possibility could be offered for hourly staff and management staff up to 120 hours put into their vacation pool upon being hired. Otherwise, beyond that, there are some other points here, but if not any questions, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Right. I see Carmen's on. Carmen, would you like to add anything for the neighbors, employees, or Supervisor Johnson? Either one of yous?
Go ahead, Carmen.
Just give me 1 second. Hello, I was just here today to talk about the in lieu of fringe edition. That was the other thing that was on this kind of all in one agenda item. So in lieu of fringe previously and is currently offered on a 30 days following a 30-day wait after the first of the month after someone has been hired. So this change would have it be effective immediately upon hire. So that's the additional payment for part-time that is in lieu of our fringe benefits. It's just another added way to recruit people and get them in the door faster versus waiting approximately 45 days, at times up to 56 days to get in that extra pay. So it's just a way to combat our struggle with pay increases across the industry. That would be for part-time employees, which it would be a full county change. That's why it went through Committee on Administration. We just happen to have the most part-time employees compared to other departments.
I think we hit all the points. Is there any questions on anything? Thank you, Carmen. If not, all right. Reports from the standing committees. Supervisor Quinn.
Yeah, thank you. PR&D dealt with several issues. One was the approval of an initial plat for a new rural subdivision in the town of Menominee, north of Highway 29, just across the railroad tracks by the nursery out there. We approved that. Approved a variance request to create a new lot in the town of Weston. We had a presentation from the Tainter Lake Rehabilitation District. It's a group of residents around Tainter Lake that are planning to organize a petition drive to establish a lake district, which would be a kind of quasi-governmental organization that would allow them to have some level of taxing with regard to special projects around the lake. That they have to get something like 700 signatures from each of the landowners. They have to get 51% of them to sign the petition. Once they're done with that, that will come back to our PR&D and then finally on to the full county board, which is required to author the establishment of that district. We also passed a resolution after several months of consideration to request $175,000 allocation of ARPA funds to establish a countywide water quality testing project that would basically establish a baseline water quality profile for the county going forward. That's about it.
Thank you. Supervisor May of Facilities.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. We held our meeting on February 23rd. A lot of business as usual things. But we had a couple of interesting things in my opinion. One of them was on the facilities fleet, which we get through Enterprise. And we had sent 6 Malibus back and we had purchased these in 2018. And so then we send them back. We got the new Malibus are in. So then what Enterprise does, they turn around and they sell these cars out. And so we use the cars for 45 months, send them back in. Because of the market for used vehicles, we now have a credit with Enterprise for $63,000. because they sold for that much higher than what we bought them for. So that was kind of interesting in my opinion. We also had some discussion on the fair when the fair board made their report, and Deb had submitted different different charts showing what other counties get, what other fairs get from counties. And the state of Wisconsin also has a grant application for fairs that she filled out or tried to fill out, but they were denied because the state of Wisconsin considers the Dunn County Fair to be a governmental fair and therefore not eligible for these grants that they offer out. And the lobbyists for the Fairs Association went to the Department of Administration and the governor to get an explanation for that. And the response from the government was, if you are a county fair considered governmental, this grant does not apply to you. However, the Wisconsin Department of Administration assumed that fairs receive funding when the county receives their funding. If you haven't, this is now the time to reach out and confirm with the county the use of your ARPA funds that the county received. Every fair needs to remind their county administrators that fairs are a tourism entity, a community partner, and in many cases used for emergency situations. Counties have received ARPA money, which fairs should ask for their usage on their grounds. So then obviously the discussion, well, what can they use the ARPA money for? And they had a couple of ideas, and one of them was for more secure fencing around the grounds to control the walk-ins, and barn fans. They could use some new barn fans. And then they also had a real pricey one for a skating rink, grandstand that I won't even go into. But so here it is. It's and as we were having our discussion about ARPA funds earlier, and we're already tagging, earmarking this for that and this for that, and then 175,000 here, it makes my head spin. So and our next meeting will be March 23rd. That is my report.
Thank you. Supervisor Anderson, CRT.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We moved our CRT meeting up 1 week earlier, so we met Monday of this week so that we could meet the deadline that all of these ISP needed to know how we were going to designate the ARPA funds, the 100,000 that we approved earlier. So Monday's meeting, we always had reports from our extension educators. And I want to remind everybody that some of our extension educators serve in 3 counties, Eau Claire, Chippewa, and Dunn. And Margaret Murphy, who was our horticulture specialist, gave a report, which I hope she will do later so the whole county board can hear how she's working with Dunn County with all of the extension or horticulture problems. And then we had a little update from Supervisor Jim Zons. Oh, I want to back up. We had one supervisor, Larry Bjork, that could not make the meeting because he had to go to Missouri and is having surgery. So he gave me a report ahead of time. And so I asked if our county board chairman, Bartlett, who was always at our meetings, which we appreciate, if he would vote on these issues so that we would have 5 people voting. And he agreed to, so I was appreciative of that, Chairman Bartlett. Then we had a little report from Jim Zons update, which you will hear at the county board meeting on the 16th of this month, 1 week from tonight. The big issue was, of course, now we got to divide up this $100,000 and to make it equitable and fair. And we had a great discussion. We had 24/7 online. If we had any questions, we had Mosaic online if they had any questions. And just a quick review, Mosaic was going to have their contract for the Township of Grant. Bloomer Telephone had their grant proposal for the Township of Colfax. And 24/7 had 5 proposals, which included the Township of Menominee, Township of Sherman, Township of Dunn, O'Galley, and Lucas. After a great deal of discussion, Supervisor Quinn had a great spreadsheet, which I really appreciated, and he laid that out. He did a lot of work by showing everybody how much townships had contributed, what the total projects were going to cost. And so we used that as our beginning cost. I already had an idea what I was going to recommend to the committee. Here's what we ended up with. And it was approved unanimously by a CR&T committee. $20,000 of that $100,000 is to go to Mosaic for the town of Grant. $20,000 will go to Bloomer Telephone for their proposal at Colfax, excuse me. And the remaining $60,000 was to be designated to 24/7. Supervisor Quinn had it kind of broken down, and I asked the committee if they would seriously allow 24/7 to prioritize it, how they feel that money could best be spent to make more a better use and where it should be used. And the committee went along with this. And now we found out that they have decided where they can finish projects and do the most good. And he broke that $66,000 down, $33,500 to the township in Menominee. Sherman will get $16,000. Town of Dunn, $5,000. The proposal for a little bit of work in O'Galley, $5,000. And there was just a portion, a little bit left to finish in Lucas, and that's $500. So that's why we did it, and we approved it unanimously, and I'm very pleased. Thank you, Chairman Bartlett, for voting in and sitting in there with us and voting on that. And that completes my, our next meeting is on the 11th of April, and that'll be my last meeting as CR&T Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Supervisor Headland, admin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you heard before from me, two resolutions bringing forward in regard to elected official compensation and changes to the handbook, including some compensation issues. Our meeting was held on Thursday, February 24th. Along with that, we moved on to you a group of the budget carry forwards. We did approve an out of class pay request for our corp counsel, and approved the recruitment for an assistant corp counsel to begin, audited the vouchers, and heard from all the reports from all the major staffs, including updates to all of their budgets. Our next meeting will be March 24th, 2022. Thank you.
Thank you. Supervisor McCullough, Highway and Transit.
We've had a busy agenda this last month. We've met 3 times since the last executive committee meeting. I will sum up as quickly as possible. The first meeting was to discuss possible application for some of the hard infrastructure bill funds that are coming through. We decided not to apply for this year's, though we will certainly apply for next year's and the year after, largely because the short term, the very short term applications would require extensive engineering on the upfront with no guarantee on our part, with no guarantee that we would get those projects. So the later ones, it's 80-20 money. So it is a much cheaper endeavor to apply for those. We also went through the finances on that at that particular meeting with a finer tooth comb. We're getting a much clearer version of all the highway inputs and outputs, and that's great. Dustin Beata did stellar work there. The next meeting after that was the hiring meeting for Dustin, who will hopefully be our new highway commissioner, assuming he's approved by the board. That's pretty self-explanatory. This morning's meeting was by and large the standard operations. We have been identifying needs for the upcoming meeting to discuss budget, including replacing some of our 25, 23-year-old trucks. I will also touch briefly on transit, where ridership has been going up nicely, so that is great to hear. And finally, hopefully, we should be getting our first round, our 2 electric buses and the charging infrastructure for those in a 6 to 8 week time frame. And our next meeting will be immediately before the executive committee next month, as it always is. And that concludes my report. Thank you.
Thank you. Supervisor Johnson and the neighbors.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The neighbors last met February 17th. Administrator Meyer provided the committee with updates from the Quality Assurance Committee. The committee offered an endorsement to change the effective date in lieu of fringe. We asked it to be added to the agenda for the February meeting of the Committee on Administration, as we discussed earlier tonight. She reported on the recruitment turnover, as well as lost time due to COVID-related issues. And we discussed challenges with the potential CNA program. The neighbors are receiving many referrals because of very few nursing homes in the area accepting. 9 people were admitted for the prior month. The census at the end of January was 95 with a high of 99. Arrowhead and Fireside remain closed at this time. We discussed recent staff and resident COVID cases. And our next meeting will be March 17th. And that's all I have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Supervisor Tripp, judicial.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually was not in attendance at the last meeting because I got called out of town on an emergency. But I can tell you that the committee took up a couple of action items. One, they passed a resolution to dispose of the old eligibility list for the sheriff's office. That means that the old list is eliminated, and to get on the new list, applicant has to apply again. Interesting sidelight on this: if there are more than 10 applicants, the Civil Service Commission meets to make a recommendation to the sheriff. We haven't met now, and Dave, you can maybe remember more than I don't think we've met in 2 years, because they never have.
2 years.
Yeah, they never have enough applicants to do that, so they're hopeful. The other issues that were taken up were the carry forward motion requests and the from emergency management in the sheriff's office that we dealt with just a little bit ago in this meeting. Our next meeting is March 28th, and that concludes my report.
Thank you. Supervisor Morehouse, Health and Human Services.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We last met on February 24th, had our regular reports from the 3 departments. Becky Kinnear from the Health Done Right Mental Health Action Team shared with us their online resource guide. We were all quite impressed. It's easy to access. It's an excellent resource. Heather Murray then joined to sort of outline for the Health and Human Services Board what the potential options are for replacing, well, not replacing, hiring a new human services manager. Chris, Supervisor Steen, and Heather and I had previously met to go through some of the options. We approved the budget carry forwards that we looked at today and reviewed the January vouchers paid. We then approved a process and a timeline for replacing the Human Services Director. It was agreed that HR will handle the search, do a public search that will allow us to look at both internal and external candidates. That goes out on an electronic platform. The full Health and Human Services Board will participate in the interview process. with HR actually handling the interview. The timeline will allow for a second interview if the board feels that that's necessary. And the plan, I think, quite doable, would have us hire a replacement in June with a start date in early July and an overlap of a month with Chris, whose last date is August 6th. Our next meeting is the 24th of March. That's my report. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. All right, thank you all. Our next meeting date is April 13th. Any announcements? I want to thank Mr. Miller. It's the last meeting I will have with him, I believe.
It's the last one I'll have with any of you.
Thank you, Paul.
I guess so, yes, but thank you. Thank you for all you've done.
My pleasure.
Absolutely.
Anything else?
Did we agree that our county board meeting next week is in person?
Yes, it will be.
All righty.
Hybrid, right?
The people who want to go on Zoom will be able to, yes.
Right. And Supervisor Johnson, you're going to be out of the country? Is that the one that you're gone?
Nope, I'll be gone March 26th.
Oh, okay.
I'll be in the airplane, so I can't Zoom it either, so.
All right.
You'll be
Okay.
zooming in a different way.
Right.
All right, well, goodbye all, and think about what you want to do for your committee meetings. Get them changed if you decide to go in person.